There is a silence that comes after a scream, a silence so heavy it presses against the walls, almost loud in itself. That silence hung thick in the underground halls of Kazan-6, and the world, beyond the steel doors of that hidden compound, never heard a whisper of it. The origins of Kazan-6 were never made public, not even to the families of those who entered and never returned. Officially, it didn't exist. Buried beneath the permafrost of a decommissioned military base in northern Russia, Kazan-6 was never drawn on any map. It was a place created out of desperation, born during the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was splintering and the world was shifting. The files marked it as an experimental psychological research facility, but those words don't begin to capture what really happened inside. What they did was unnatural. The experiment was designed by a man the records only refer to as Dr. Thomas Avery. His real name, some believe, was erased deliberately, either by the government or by his own hand. Avery wasn't Russian, he was American, a defector or a collaborator. No one can say for certain, but his obsession was clear: to understand what breaks the human mind, and more importantly, what happens after it breaks. His theory was cruel and brilliant. He believed that fear wasn't the limit of human emotion. It was merely a doorway, and if one could be pushed far enough past terror, into a place where the mind no longer recognized the rules of time, identity, or memory, something else would emerge. Something primal, something pure. The subjects of the experiment were not volunteers. They were political prisoners, war criminals, and in at least one case, a journalist who had gotten too close. They were told they were being moved to another holding facility. They were blindfolded, loaded onto unmarked trucks, and driven for days across frozen terrain until even the guards stopped knowing where they were. What waited at Kazan-6 was not a cell. It was the screaming room. It was not called that officially, of course. On paper it was labeled Chamber B, but everyone in the facility, guards, scientists, maintenance staff, called it the screaming room. Because once the door closed, once the lights flickered out and the soundproofed walls sealed, that's all anyone heard, hour after hour, night after night, screaming. There were no beds inside, no windows. No way to mark the passage of time. The walls were bare, but painted a shade of off, white that disoriented the eyes. The lights overhead pulsed in strange rhythms, never completely dark, never fully lit. Temperature and air pressure fluctuated at irregular intervals. Sounds, recordings of children crying, metal scraping, unintelligible whispers, were played randomly through hidden speakers. And then there were the mirrors. 4 mirrored panels stood on each wall, perfectly symmetrical. At first glance the subject saw only their own reflection, but as the hours passed, the reflections would shift, not all at once, not in obvious ways. One would blink slightly out of sync, another might smile when the subject didn't, and sometimes for just a second one reflection wouldn't be human at all. The psychological toll was immediate and severe. Within 24 hours, the subjects stopped sleeping. Within 72 hours, most stopped speaking. Around the 5th day, they began to pace in circles, whispering to themselves. By the 7th day, nearly all had experienced hallucinations so vivid they believed themselves to be somewhere else entirely, sometimes back in their childhood, sometimes in war, and sometimes in places no one could understand. One man reportedly begged to be let out because the voices behind the mirror said the floor would swallow him by sunrise. When they finally opened the door on the 10th day, he had clawed most of his fingernails off trying to dig through the concrete. But not all broke in the same way. One subject, a 38-year-old woman named Alina Markov, didn't scream at all. She just sat in the corner, staring at the mirrors. No food, no water, no reaction to the lights or sounds. After 11 days, when they finally pulled her out, her pupils had dilated so far her irises vanished completely. She didn't speak, she didn't blink, and when they tried to guide her to the infirmary, she began humming a melody no one recognized. When they played it back later on tape, the melody repeated itself backwards, exactly, flawlessly, with not a single note altered. Avery was ecstatic to him. This was proof that something new could be reached. That fear wasn't the end. It was the portal. He called it transcendental dissociation. His theory claimed that the mind, when pushed to absolute dissolution, would begin to reassemble itself, but differently, free from morality, free from logic, free from the constraints of shared human experience. In that state, he believed, the subject could see beyond time and memory into something truer, but not everyone in the facility shared his vision. By the end of the second month, 2 junior scientists had filed anonymous warnings to external agencies. One disappeared en route to Moscow. The other was found dead in his room, hanging from the light fixture, though the fixture was only 4 feet from the ground and his knees were still touching the floor. Still, the experiment continued. Every week, a new subject was introduced into the screaming room. They were given no names, only numbers. Some lasted 5 days, others broke within hours. One man, subject 14, reportedly began speaking in a language no one could identify, scribbling symbols on the walls in his own blood that mirrored ancient Sumerian cuneiform. Another, subject 19, claimed that the mirrors had begun showing him events from the future. In one chilling moment captured by surveillance footage, he looked into the glass and calmly said, "Avery dies in the red hallway." Doctor. Avery laughed it off, until 3 weeks later, when the emergency lights in the West Wing malfunctioned and cast the hallway in a deep, blood-red hue. He didn't die, but he refused to walk through that corridor ever again. It was during the 10th cycle of experimentation that the real shift occurred. The cameras inside the screaming room began malfunctioning, not in conventional ways. There were no blank screens, no static. Instead, the footage would begin to loop small segments of time that hadn't happened yet. A subject might be seen standing in the corner, staring at nothing, and then, seconds before he actually moved, the camera would show him suddenly appearing behind the door. Then, moments later, he'd vanish again, only to appear where he had originally been. Technicians thought it was corruption in the data feed, but when they reviewed the internal logs, they found no glitches. No loops, the timeline had flowed as normal, only the footage didn't agree. On day 103, every screen in the control room went black at once, for exactly 3 minutes. When they came back online, the screaming room was empty. Completely empty, no furniture, no mirrors, no subject, nothing but 4 bare walls. The door had never opened. What happened next, the days that followed, was scrubbed from every official archive. What few notes remain are heavily redacted, written in fragmented phrases. Auditory bleed through increasing. D-class personnel exhibiting synchronization episodes. Containment protocols breached at 0, 4s, arrows, 0 hours. And finally, the last entry dated July 14, 1991. Project Kazan-6 terminated. Room sealed. Facility abandoned. But the silence that followed was not peace. It was a silence so heavy it felt like something still waited in it, something that had been let out or let in. And in the dead frost of the northern Russian wastes, there are locals who swear that if you press your ear to the ground near the remains of the old compound on certain nights, you'll hear it screaming. Fear was currency during the Cold War. Not bullets, not bombs, not even nuclear warheads. It was fear, carefully cultivated, meticulously distributed, and quietly weaponized, that held the world in a suspended breath from 1947 to the early 1990s. To understand the birth of Kazan-6, One must first understand what kind of world could justify its creation. Following the Second World War, the geopolitical chessboard fractured into two unrelenting ideologies. The capitalist West, spearheaded by the United States, and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union. On paper it was a war of ideas, but beneath treaties and television broadcasts, it was a war of shadows. It was psychological. By the 1950s, both nations had realized that the human mind was a battlefield, one with no physical borders, no defined armies, and no rules of engagement. The United States had already launched MKUltra under the CIA, a secret project experimenting with mind control, hallucinogenic drugs, hypnosis, and sensory deprivation. They tested on prisoners, on psychiatric patients, on their own citizens without consent. But the Soviets, they watched and they learned. In 1959, deep inside a gray, concrete-walled building in Leningrad, the USSR Ministry of Internal Affairs initiated Program 12. K, a classified directive to investigate what they called non-consensual psychological influence models. Unlike the West, the Soviets were not merely interested in controlling minds. They wanted to reshape them. Their files used terms like neurological erasure, cognitive inversion, and most chilling of all, emotive destabilization through environmental trauma. In simple terms, they wanted to know how to destroy a human mind and rebuild it into something new. At first it was basic, harsh interrogations, sleep deprivation, isolation chambers, but those methods only produced surface-level cracks. What they wanted was a fracture, a total collapse of identity. By 1963, this ambition gave birth to a black budget operation known only by its code, Zimnyaya Nisha, the Winter Niche. What began as a military psychology unit operating out of a university basement in Novosibirsk quickly evolved into something else entirely. Backed by the KGB, Zimnyaya Nisha was given unchecked authority to explore advanced trauma conditioning protocols. And with that authority came power. Power to detain, relocate, and experiment under full legal protection, so long as the findings remained useful to the state. By the mid-70s, reports suggest the program had spread into remote regions of the Soviet Union, abandoned mines, defunct missile silos, repurposed Arctic outposts, all beneath the radar, all undocumented. It is believed that Kazan-6 was one of those outposts, but unlike the others, it was not born from research. It was born from fear, specifically a fear inside the Kremlin itself. The Soviet leadership had begun to unravel by the 1980s. Economic instability, Afghan defeat, rising dissent. The once iron-tight grip on information was loosening. Leaders feared revolution, betrayal, and espionage more than foreign bombs. And in this tightening spiral of paranoia, the mind became the final weapon. Unofficial transcripts from a closed KGB briefing in 1985 mention a disturbing shift in rhetoric. Intelligence officers no longer spoke of capturing agents or decoding messages. They spoke of psychological hardening, of neuro-censorship, of remapping internal resistance pathways. And in the margins of one heavily redacted file, dated November 18, 1986, a chilling handwritten phrase appears, "Break the scream, what survives is pure." This phrase, later attributed to Dr. Thomas Avery, would become the unofficial mantra of Kazan-6. Avery's involvement at this point is still disputed. Some historians claim he was part of an early MKUltra subproject known as Sub-Basel. Others believe he worked independently, drawn to the Soviet Union not by ideology but by opportunity. What is clear is this: he arrived when the system was most vulnerable. With the Soviet infrastructure crumbling, bureaucratic oversight nearly non-existent, and thousands of Cold War secrets buried under decades of silence, Avery saw a chance to create something no Western lab would ever allow. The early blueprints of Kazan-6, if they can be trusted, show a facility unlike any other, not a lab, not a prison, but a containment chamber for psychological dissection. It was built under the guise of a biological storage bunker, complete with falsified vaccine records, shipping logs, and supply chains routed through decommissioned military hospitals. Its actual layout, however, was far more disturbing. A long central corridor, windowless, concrete-lined, connected 6 separate pods, each pod designed to house environmental variables, extreme cold, persistent white noise, strobing light, negative pressure. But at the very end of the corridor, sealed behind 3 layers of reinforced blast doors, was a room marked B. Not room B, just B. Blueprints don't show what was inside it. The internal notes only list its purpose in one line: prolonged isolation sensory readaptation chamber. Unofficially, it became known as the Screaming Room, and by late 1987 it was operational. But what distinguished Kazan-6 from every other Cold War experiment was not just its secrecy, it was its goal. Most Western programs sought to extract information, to manipulate behavior, to plant ideas. Kazan-6 sought to erase the self entirely. Avery's theory of transcendental dissociation, as explored in Chapter 1, was not merely philosophical. He had developed a full psychological framework around it, combining Soviet trauma, conditioning, American sensory deprivation methods, and a unique obsession with mirror, phase disorientation. The KGB, desperate and intrigued, funded him, but with 2 conditions. 1. No test subject could survive beyond containment threshold phase 7. 2. No written records were to be removed from the facility, ever. These were not scientific safeguards. These were fear-based mandates designed to protect the state, not the people inside. Yet despite its darkness, Kazan-6 wasn't entirely invisible. Over time, whispers began to leak. Soviet soldiers stationed in nearby Arctic outposts reported strange sounds echoing through the permafrost like distant howls played through metal grates. Local villagers spoke of lights in the sky, of trucks arriving without headlights in the middle of the night, of the air tasting like electricity. One fisherman claimed he found a box on the riverbank. Inside it, torn journal pages soaked in blood and ink. The handwriting, though partially illegible, repeated a single phrase: "The mirrors don't lie, they remember." Western intelligence agencies picked up fragments, mostly static. But one NSA report, now declassified, includes a cryptic note: unknown Russian site, Cold Zone 4, psychological leakage event suspected, recommend auditory filters. What exactly an auditory leakage event meant remains unknown. But insiders have suggested it refers to the phenomenon of residual psychological imprinting, where even non-subject personnel exposed to the environment of Kazan-6 began experiencing symptoms: hallucinations, disassociation, vivid dreams of screams behind walls they'd never seen. The deeper the Cold War descended into fear, the darker its laboratories became, and somewhere, buried beneath a forgotten coordinate in the northern ice, Kazan-6 dug its roots. It didn't just study fear, it worshipped it, and in time it learned how to feed on it. The war may have ended, the flags may have changed, but Kazan-6 wasn't built for a country. It was built for an idea that terror can be a tool, that the human mind can be shattered and reforged, and that somewhere, beyond the scream, something waits. But something changed in 1979. A stray packet of files was intercepted by West German intelligence during a low-level KGB courier operation across the Berlin corridor. Inside were reports coded in Z-class encryption, normally reserved for internal psychological assessment logs. One document, heavily redacted, mentioned a phrase that hadn't appeared in any known Soviet archive, operats, ihr Kazan-6. That phrase made its way across desks like a virus. In Langley, a low-ranking analyst named Bernard Trask flagged it and compiled a 38-page dossier cross, referencing everything known about Soviet psychological testing. He found nothing, no facility records, no personnel. But the phrase repeated across 3 separate documents, subject unrecoverable after exposure, acoustic threshold exceeded, and chillingly, the screaming room. From then on, whispers grew louder inside intelligence circles. Rumors of a hidden installation, somewhere beyond the Ural Mountains, where the Soviets tested the human mind not with drugs or hypnosis, but with sound, not sound as we know it, frequencies not meant for ears. Patterns not designed to communicate, but to destroy. There were testimonies, some shaky, some lucid, surfacing from defectors who had worked in the shadowy realm of Soviet psychotronics. A former GRU technician, Viktor Malenkov, defected to Sweden in 1981 and was held in protective custody. During a closed-door interview, he described a vault sealed in concrete, deep beneath a communications facility outside Kazan. He spoke of a chamber with no lights, no cameras, only wiring that led to a box with no signal, and speakers that emitted a frequency that made men forget their names. He claimed the room had no official designation, only a nickname used by guards, Krikovaya Komnata, the screaming room. Malenkov's testimony was dismissed officially. The CIA classified the tape, but in underground circles, audio snippets allegedly from that interview were leaked in the late 80s. The recording is grainy, but the final seconds are unforgettable. A trembling voice, low and urgent, whispering in Russian. They said it was an experiment, but the room wasn't built to measure sound. It was built to contain something. A former janitor working at a military outpost near Kazan recalled an event from 1973. He claimed trucks delivered human cargo late at night. No records, no manifests. Just pale, dazed prisoners led into a subterranean section of the base. He never saw them come out. Another story surfaced from an old East German technician who worked on communication jamming systems. He recalled a test transmission picked up in 1977 that was not a signal, but a scream, modulated like code, but organic, too real to be synthetic. No official department ever acknowledged Kazan-6. It doesn't appear on Soviet maps, not even in declassified defense logs, but repeated references to Sector 06 acoustic regulation appear in transcripts of Soviet test plans regarding behavioral agitation experiments. It's also around this time that Dr. Andrei Korovkin's name reappears, a figure previously linked to Project Black Echo, which was rumored to explore audio hallucinations induced through layered wave interference. His disappearance from Moscow University in 1975 was never explained, but a university ID badge bearing his name was later found in a burned-out storage bunker on the outskirts of Kazan, sealed in a jar. From testimonies to broken logs, the puzzle formed a pattern: unregistered experiments, sound distortion, psychological collapse, and one recurring phrase etched into the edge of fear itself, the screaming room. In 1986, just weeks before Chernobyl, another anomaly surfaced. A declassified map from a defunct Soviet radio triangulation station marked a Zone 6B restricted acoustic testing. Analysts noticed that this zone formed a geometric interference pattern with 3 shortwave broadcast towers, triangulated perfectly toward an underground site southwest of Kazan. The location matched where Malenkov had described the buried chamber. Then the file was sealed again. Those who tried to dig deeper faced strange ends. The journalist who interviewed Malenkov vanished during a hiking trip in Romania. The West German technician who duplicated the intercepted signal committed suicide in a Berlin motel, his walls covered in handwritten spirals. Even Bernard Trask, the analyst who flagged Operatia Kazan-6, suffered a nervous breakdown. According to a redacted NSA memo, he was found in his apartment repeating one sentence for hours. "The sound doesn't end when you turn it off." The evidence was thin, scattered, but disturbingly consistent. Something existed, not just a room, not just a chamber of concrete and wires, but a place where the mind unraveled, not by what it saw, but by what it heard. A room never meant to record anything. A room designed to test the threshold of silence and scream, and erase the very memory of where the scream began. It wasn't science anymore, it was something else, a doorway carved in frequencies, a prison with no bars. And somewhere in its center, something was still screaming. The voice on the tape was clearer now, but it wasn't speaking Russian. It wasn't speaking any language anyone could confidently identify. The analyst who reviewed it initially thought it was a dialect or coded signal, but the rhythm had a mechanical consistency, repetitive but not random. It was almost patterned, like a metronome corrupted by grief. Several experts were brought in, linguists, cryptographers, even musicologists. Each walked away unsettled. One analyst, based in Leningrad, submitted a short internal memo that would later vanish from all known archives. In it he wrote, "This is not a language, this is not speech, it is memory refracted through madness." That particular tape became known internally as Voice Sample 11. K, and only a handful of high-clearance personnel were allowed to listen to it. Most refused to hear it more than once. The man who played it 3 times in a row, a KGB sub, director by the name of Mikhail Antonov, was found catatonic in his office the next morning, eyes wide open, jaw locked, blood on his hands from digging his fingernails into his palms. His last known words to his assistant the night before, "It's not what she said, it's what she remembered." After Antonov's incident, Voice Sample 11, K was locked inside Vault Z21, deep in the bowels of the Kazan Intelligence Repository. But its echoes didn't stop there. The researchers assigned to investigate the origins of the screaming phenomena began to report. Identical dreams, each described a long, windowless hallway, dim lighting. Steel doors on both sides, and a low, almost imperceptible humming sound, like a generator submerged in water. But the most disturbing commonality wasn't the setting, it was the sound. In every dream there was a scream. Not loud, not sudden, but distant, constant, as if it had been happening long before the dream began, and would continue long after the dream ended. No 2 descriptions of the scream matched exactly, but each person described the same sensation, that the scream was alive. A presence, a thing that knew it was being listened to and wanted to be heard. One researcher, Elena Volkova, kept a dream journal, a meticulous log of each nightmare every night for 6 months. In her final entry before she was transferred without warning, she wrote something that was later underlined in red by an unnamed intelligence officer. "The scream doesn't want to escape. It wants you to stay." A week later, her apartment was emptied overnight. Neighbors reported men in plain clothes carrying out boxes of papers and reels of film. No one saw Elena again. The fear inside Kazan-6 wasn't driven by disobedience or paranoia. It was something else. Something more primal. Something about the experiment had started feeding back not into the subjects, but into the observers. In 1972, 2 internal experiments were authorized to investigate the auditory phenomena more directly. The goal: reproduce the environmental conditions of the original subject chambers and monitor brain activity in real time using experimental Soviet EEG devices. 12 subjects, all volunteers, mostly soldiers, a few prisoners. Within the first 48 hours, 3 begged to be released, not because of sleep deprivation, not because of hallucinations, but because of sound. One said he could hear crying in the walls. Another said it was laughter. The third refused to describe it at all, only that it was not meant for human ears. They terminated the experiment after 72 hours. Not because of the subjects, but because 2 technicians monitoring the EEG waveforms began vomiting blood and seizing after being exposed to what they called signal echoes. That's when someone made the connection. It wasn't just the screaming they were recording. It wasn't just the sound. The equipment, analog, imperfect, vulnerable, was copying more than noise. It was copying presence, emotion, madness. One tape, now destroyed, allegedly played itself back without a power source. A maintenance worker, cleaning a storage room 2 floors above the vault, claimed he heard a woman whispering to him through the air ducts. He had no access to any of the recordings, no exposure to subjects, no clearance, and yet when asked what she said, he replied calmly, "She said thank you for listening." After that, all field research ceased, no more recordings were made, no more playbacks authorized. Vault Z21 was sealed under 3 layers of physical and chemical lockout, and its contents were only accessible through 2-man authentication. Even mentioning Kazan-6 became grounds for removal, but a few didn't let go. One of them, a junior analyst named Pavel Krylov, continued his own private investigation. He tracked patterns in internal incident reports, anomalies in equipment behavior, personnel transfers. He mapped everything. And what he found was horrifying. Every time the recordings were played, there was a corresponding incident elsewhere in the facility, sometimes days later, sometimes in unrelated departments, sudden emotional collapses, unexplained aggression, hallucinations, nightmares. It was as if the scream had a half-life. Something recorded in room 5C could echo into a maintenance wing 2 floors up, or into the mind of a scientist who never heard the sound, but shared the same building. The walls couldn't contain it. The wires couldn't mute it. What started as an experiment in isolation had become a parasite with reach. When Pavel tried to escalate his findings, he was accused of fabricating reports. His clearance was revoked, his apartment was searched, and 3 days later he was found drowned in the facility's cooling reservoir. Autopsy noted fingernail marks on his own neck, as if he tried to pull something off of him. The final memo related to Kazan-6 came in 1975. It was 1 line, handwritten by a major in Soviet Psychological Operations Command. It was not what we put into the room, it was what came out of it. And then the records stopped. But the echoes didn't. Some say the tapes still exist, buried beneath concrete and dust. Others claim fragments were smuggled out and copied analog to analog, like a contagion passed through wires. They say if you listen carefully late at night when the air is still, you might hear something in the static, not words, not even sound, just a feeling that something was recorded and it hasn't stopped playing. They were never officially called prisoners, not on the documents, not in the reports. On paper, they didn't exist at all. Some were listed as volunteers, others simply labeled Unit 013, Unit 206, stripped of names, stripped of identity. But make no mistake, these were not volunteers. They were stolen lives, plucked from cities, villages, psychiatric hospitals, prisons, anywhere they wouldn't be missed too quickly. Many were labeled as unfit, by Soviet standards, dissidents, thinkers, loners, defectors. Some were from psychiatric institutions, those whose grip on reality had already begun to loosen. Others were convicted criminals, but a haunting pattern emerged in the profiles that leaked decades later. Each individual chosen possessed something deeply fragile. A mind already frayed, susceptible, fear-reactive, empathic, the kind of mind that didn't just hear a sound, but felt it, lived inside it. The records suggest the process began with total sensory disorientation. The units were led down long corridors underground, each turn carefully choreographed to confuse direction. Light was stripped away, then time, then identity. The rooms were small, barely large enough to lie down. No sharp edges, no color. The walls were made of a special Soviet composite, rubber and steel, with layers of unknown insulation that absorbed all echo. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was predatory. You couldn't even hear your own breath properly. It was like being buried alive in still air. For the first 12 hours there was nothing, just silence, a silence that grew louder the longer you sat with it. One subject, according to a technician's declassified field notes, began muttering to himself just 4 hours in, convinced he could hear rats crawling through his skin. Then came the sound. It was always different. Tailored, some were fed a loop of whispers, slow, rhythmic, just beyond clarity. Others were subjected to incoherent screams layered with faint ticking sounds, or crying children played in reverse. The most disturbing pattern involved recordings of the subject's own voice, harvested during the intake process and now warped, slowed down, whispering things they never remembered saying. The objective wasn't simply to scare them. It was to break them, not just the mind, but the boundary between internal and external reality, to make a person question whether the terror was coming from outside or within. Survivors, if you could call them that reported feeling as though the room itself was alive. Watching, breathing, one subject repeatedly screamed at the ceiling, "Why are you inside my thoughts?" Another kept trying to claw behind the wall paneling, insisting his shadow self was trapped in there and wanted out. No clocks, no feeding schedule, no way to tell how many days had passed, and as sleep deprivation set in, hallucinations began to take form, not random visions. These were themed, recurrent, personal. A woman taken from a Moscow psychiatric ward, Unit 094, believed she was back in her childhood home, but something was off. The rooms were warped, too large, her mother's face was blank. When she woke from this hallucination, her fingers were bloody. She tried to open the window by ripping out the wall wiring with her teeth. What's more disturbing is that the hallucinations across subjects started to overlap. Multiple people, kept in separate cells, under different audio treatment. It's reported seeing the child in the corner. A boy aged 6 or 7, wearing a gas mask. He never moved, never spoke, just stood watching. One defector, who claimed to have handled Kazan-6 documentation in 1979, said the researchers were fascinated by these shared hallucinations. They began intentionally feeding subjects overlapping themes, images of abandoned playgrounds, numbers scratched into doors, old Soviet propaganda recordings slowed to inhuman pitches. Over time, it became hard to tell whether they were studying mental collapse or accidental communication. Were the hallucinations influencing each other across sealed walls? And then the screaming, not from the speakers, from the subjects themselves. At first, the screams were panicked, human, animal-like, but they evolved, became harmonic. Subjects screamed in repeating tones, patterns, rhythms that resembled language but were unintelligible. A nurse on rotation at Kazan-6 for just 1 week claimed that 4 subjects, kept apart in separate rooms, began screaming the same 3, out sequence every night at 2:17 a.m. They called it the chorus. No one could explain it. Sleep cycles were long destroyed by then. Most subjects experienced rapid physical decline, hair loss, sores, erratic heart rates, but the real damage was unseen. Subjects became fixated on numbers, on the walls, on patterns in the noise. They believed they were receiving messages. One survivor, his real name never revealed, was smuggled into the West in the early 90s. He had been kept in the screaming room for 83 days. He never spoke again, but he carved symbols obsessively into any surface he could find. Wood, soap, skin, the same pattern over and over. A triangle inside a circle, surrounded by what looked like radio frequencies. When asked what it meant, he only pointed at his ear, then at the ground. Some theorists believe the sounds used in the screaming room weren't just random chaos. They were based on frequencies tested during Soviet radar experiments in the 60s, frequencies known to induce nausea, dread, and hallucinations when sustained. Others believe a deeper experiment was at play, that Kazan-6 was a conduit, not just to control the mind, but to reach something buried beneath it. The final phase of testing, according to fragmented logs, involved sensory deprivation paired with exposure to a new audio file. File 17, also nicknamed the signal. It was 47 minutes long. No one outside the project ever heard it, except one man, Dr. Yuri Malenkov, a junior acoustics researcher, was accidentally exposed to the full signal when a security protocol failed. According to reports, he collapsed, convulsing for 7 minutes. When he woke, he was mute. A week later, he gouged out both of his eyes using the sharpened edge of his ID badge. His final written note before taking his own life simply said, "It's not a sound, it's a place, and we're not supposed to be there." They thought they had silenced the room, that with the final sealing of the corridor and the disposal of the tapes, the past would remain buried beneath iron doors and concrete walls. But silence is not always absence. Sometimes it's the echo of something too loud to process. After the recovery team left Kazan-6 and the preliminary findings were filed, a different kind of team arrived. They didn't wear standard military uniforms. No insignias, no names, their faces were unreadable, like men conditioned to forget themselves. They moved with precision, cataloging everything, removing certain items without logging them. The camera from Corridor 9 vanished. So did the clipboard from Doctor. Zoran's desk, the one with initials matching names that appeared in no Soviet registry. The room with the scratched walls was filled with foam sealant. Every surface sterilized, painted over. The tapes, the few that weren't already melted into brittle loops, were collected and destroyed. But rumors emerged that one reel had been smuggled out, something unmarked, wrapped in old medical gauze, buried under other irrelevant records. The man who claimed to have seen it later recanted his statement. After disappearing for 2 weeks, when he returned, he didn't speak of Kazan-6 again. He left his position and moved to a remote village in Siberia, changing his name. Among the classified transcripts that did survive, there was one note scribbled in the margin of a soldier's report. It wasn't typed, just a pencil line, shaky, faint. It read, "She spoke in my mother's voice." No one knew what it meant. No woman had been reported in the experiment, but then again, so much of what was recorded didn't line up. The official roster listed 8 male prisoners, but some reports referenced Subject 9. No record of him. No image, just a name, Milos. Who was Milos? Doctor, Zoran's personal journal, recovered from a safe in his Leningrad apartment after his death, mentioned a 9th test subject, one that had arrived without documentation. He wrote cryptically, "He does not eat, he does not blink. He knows things I haven't told anyone." That was the final entry. The journal was deemed inadmissible and never mentioned again. Kazan-6 was shuttered indefinitely. No formal announcement, no press. Even among Soviet archives, it became a ghost referenced only in codes, buried in files with falsified dates. To anyone on the outside it never existed, but inside the intelligence community, especially among the old guard, the name Kazan-6 carried a warning. Young analysts were told not to dig. One of them did. His name was Sokolov. He died in a car crash. The report said his brakes failed on a dry road in broad daylight. Over the years, whispers of the screaming room leaked out. A former Soviet nurse claimed she once treated a survivor from Kazan-6 in a secure military ward in Minsk. The man screamed only during thunderstorms. His EEG scans showed the kind of brain damage usually seen in high-voltage torture victims. He had no scars, just blackened fingernails, and complete amnesia except for a single sentence he repeated every hour. She was made of sound. But perhaps the most chilling account came not from a survivor, but from a security officer stationed at Kazan-6 during its dismantling. He confessed in a recorded conversation, smuggled and translated years later, that the final act before sealing the room was a prayer. Not a Soviet ritual, but something older. Something spoken in a language he couldn't identify. He didn't say who led it, only that it wasn't one of them. His words were slow, cracked with fear. I never believed in devils, but that day I watched men walk out of that room without shadows. The West dismissed these reports as Cold War paranoia. But even in the U.S., documents with references to Kazan-6 were found in strange places, margin notes in MKUltra files, blacked out names in CIA memos, a Pentagon report titled simply, Acoustic Containment Limitations. There was never any direct connection. Just anomalies. And what of the room itself? In 1994, a private European tech firm applied for rights to conduct environmental testing in the remote Russian zone where Kazan-6 was located. Their request was denied without explanation. Their lead researcher disappeared in transit. His wife claimed he left a voicemail the night before, whispering a phrase over and over, "The walls are breathing." To this day, no confirmed photographs of the screaming room exist. No footage, no voice recordings, only silence, but some say the silence has a shape. There are audio engineers who claim to have picked up inexplicable waveforms while scanning Cold War-era transmission bands. Buried in static, layered beneath coded numbers and hissing dials, an intermittent pulse that forms the pattern of a scream, stretched to infinity. Others dismiss these as hoaxes, the product of digital interference or imagination. But those who have spent too long listening know better. They say the room didn't just amplify fear. It became fear. A frequency locked not to walls or wires, but to consciousness itself. In 2021, a small group of independent investigators attempted to track down the current location of the Kazan facility. They followed decades-old maps, satellite imagery, declassified blueprints. They found concrete foundations in the snow. Half-buried steel doors, but the corridor leading to Section 9 was gone. Not collapsed, gone, as if that part of the structure had never existed, as if reality itself had rewritten its map to forget. And yet, in the middle of that frozen silence, one of them reported hearing it, a faint vibration in the jaw, a pressure behind the ears, a whisper that wasn't heard but understood. They left without collecting samples. They never published their findings. No names were given, just a title, Echoes of the Ninth Door. And so we're left with questions. Was the screaming room merely an experimental chamber in a forgotten Cold War complex? Or was it something deeper, a doorway not to another place, but to a part of the mind untouched by light? We don't know. We may never know. But if you ever find yourself alone in a quiet room, and the silence feels just a bit too loud, don't listen too closely, because some rooms were never meant to echo back. But maybe that's exactly what they want, for us to question just enough, feel just enough, but never know enough. to leave Kazan-6 buried beneath redacted ink, and a cold wind that still howls where screams once did. But stories like these, they don't vanish, they echo, in voices, in shadows, in unfinished files passed from trembling hands to curious minds like yours. So now it's your turn to decide, was it madness or method? Truth or terror? And if this was Kazan-6, how many other rooms are still screaming out there? If this story shook you, share it. Let the silence be broken. And if you're brave enough to keep digging into the unknown, subscribe. Because the next chapter might already be watching you. This was unknown chapter, and this room was never truly empty.